And we are recording. All right. Hi, Pete. How are you?
Hey, good. How are you?
Are you? I'm good. Thank you. Welcome to Thoughtful Minds, a podcast. Thank you for joining us today. So, before we crack on with it, just could you give us a bit of an introduction just for the audience, just to know who you are and what do you do?
Sure. I am a
Sure. I'm a
professor at the
professor at
University
the
of Vermont
University of Vermont
in political
in political
science and
science
global
and global
studies.
studies.
I currently run
I
our Middle
currently
East
run our
Studies
Middle East Studies
program,
program,
uh,
uh,
teach courses
teach
on
courses on
international
international
relations, Middle
relations,
East
Middle East
politics,
politics,
terrorism, religion
terrorism,
and
religion
peace,
and peace,
Israel and
Israel and
Palestine.
Palestine.
Um,
Um,
my research is
my
on
research
religion
on
and
religion and
conflict and foreign policy, and I'm starting to do work on religion and peace building. I used to work at the Pew Research Center. I ran their project on global religious freedom. I also worked in DC for 10 years as a in counterterrorism and international relations type analysis with the U.S. government and other agencies. Um, I went to Vassar College in New York, and I'm from Philly originally.
All right. All right. That's interesting. So there's a lot of things I want to unpack. But I always like to ask people who go on the podcast first is kind of like what pulls them into their area of interest. So what kind of pulled you into studying religion and global politics? Was it something personal, intellectual? Was it like a moment in your life? Or so what kind of dragged you into it?
It's sort of a mix of, I guess, personal and professional and pragmatic. So I'm a person of faith myself. I'm a Christian, so that's always been a part of my life, although I never really thought of it as part of my academics. Like I didn't study religion in college, uh, but I did work for a professor in college who was writing a book on Christianity and U.S. foreign policy. And so, as part of that, I read the foreign policy statements of all different Christian denominations and how they varied between the more liberal, progressive mainline Protestant and then the more conservative evangelicals. And that got really interested in how religion is applied to foreign policy. I also 9/11 was my second week of college, so that got me, and went to school outside New York City, and it was a little bit uh, oh, opened my eyes, right? In that suddenly this college experience is not the only thing that matters. It got me thinking about how I didn't know much about Islam at that point, but I knew religion is a wonderful, beautiful thing, and how something so wonderful could be used in such a way. Uh, and so those interests, I studied Arabic. I ended up getting a job in Washington, D.C., as I mentioned, working in counterterrorism. And as part of that, I read a lot of things on Islam and how Al Qaeda tried to justify what they were doing. But then when I went to grad school, I applied, and an advisor reached out when I got in and said, "Oh, looks like you're really interested in religion and politics. That's a good thing to study right now." I'm like, oh, I guess I am interested in that. So those things sort of came together to drive me for that. And initially, it was focusing on religion and terrorism, how religion makes terrorism worse across all different faiths. But I gradually became more interested in the broader societal impacts of religion, and that was what my dissertation and first book were on.
All right. I mean, it's super interesting. It's very relevant to me, by the way, because I mean, for me personally, I didn't go down that route, so I just went through pharmacy and whatnot. But as I got older, I just got very interested, as in terms of how it impacts our lives. I mean, I'm a religious person myself. I'm a Muslim, third culture kid. I grew up in Canada, by the way, and I've always been kind of interested at, how, the events that happen and how they kind of shaped our lives and so on. I'm actually working on a piece, but anyways, so it's interesting that you kind of used that and then you had the opportunity to kind of dive into that and then it became kind of your profession. So one of the things that I'd be interested to unpack is obviously you've been in this space for a while now. You've worked on religion, migration, violence, and so on. Like, how has your understanding of religion, evolved over the years?
Yeah, it's been tricky, right? So on a personal level, I've always found the scripture and religious beliefs to matter a lot. But academically, I'd always sort of taken a step back from that, and that I
Mhm.
think it's hard to really measure um, beliefs and how they're activated. And then especially when you're talking about Islam, it can be dangerous, I think, because there's so many, Orientalist, essentialist arguments that sort of demonize Islam by saying, oh, look, this one passage in the Quran led to this problem. And so I was always hesitant to go that route. Um, and obviously, some of that was also sort of professional. It's just the way social science works, it's harder to talk about deep religious beliefs. But now that I'm at a point in my career where I don't have to go up for promotion again, I started thinking more about this, and I realized that yes, religious practices are what connects religion to the world, but these beliefs matter, and so trying to take them seriously again, because I've been challenged on that by mentors. Like, are you saying religion itself doesn't matter? It's just religious laws or religious organizations. I've never really thought that, but that's often how it came across in my work. And I think we can find a way to really engage. You mentioned, theologically, or in terms of public theology, there's a lot of value there. We might get into this later, but I also have been frustrated with some of these discussions. Excuse me, like when I was in DC, we have lots of interfaith dialogue discussions, and it just felt very surface level. And it was like, okay, like we're not going to kill each other, and that's great, but how do we actually live together? We have very, very deep, sincere religious beliefs. How do we recognize the value of both of them in a way that lets us coexist? And that's something I've struggled to figure out how to discuss, I think.
Yeah, that's very interesting because, as you said, there is this sort of how do we coexist and go beyond just superficial. As you said, we're not going to kill each other. We're not going to do this and that. I mean, especially now. I think now, if there was ever a time where it's kind of a melting pot. You know what I mean? With all the kind of chaos that's going on. I like the fact that you said, religion matters. I'm going a bit off topic here, but that's just something that I'm curious about because one of my best friends, he's like a brother as well. He's a Christian. We talk about this and the value of religion, but maybe in our interactions, I don't want to generalize. It seems like it's not on the front burner for a lot of people. Do you know what I mean? It's kind of like this thing, but it doesn't really matter right now. What value does it hold? So how do you kind of combat or navigate the argument or make the argument of religious matters in the modern day now, where the stance is like it's kind of this cool thing. It gave us some nice cultural things, but it doesn't really matter.
Yeah, that's tricky. I think on a social level, it's different in the States than in the UK because religion is a big deal here. Not often in a good way, right? I as a Christian, I'm very sensitive to the fact that my faith is being used for negative purposes by by political leaders and things like that. But the problem is that so many people then see faith as a negative thing, and it's hard to make the case that there's a lot of good that has been done in the world. You think of the democracy movements in Eastern Europe and the civil rights movement in the United States that were driven by faith. And how do we emphasize that without downplaying the negative aspects of it? And that's something I still struggle with. And some of it is pointing out like the modal person of faith in the United States is not, just a white guy like me. It's very diverse within Christianity, but also in Islam and Hinduism and other faiths. I'm realizing that this matters deeply to lots of people, and to dismiss it as a problem. Academically, it's a little harder, right? After 9/11, everyone in political science, international relations said we're going to take religion seriously. And we had, major edited volumes coming out by big name scholars. And then it all kind of disappeared. We have a very robust religion and politics and religion and international relations sections in the professional societies I'm part of, but we're often isolated. We talk to each other, right? And it's hard to break out of that. And so, I mean, what I've tried to do on the scholarly side is sort of directly confront existing explanations, right? So there's work on why states go to war and why conflict becomes more intense. And I was like, okay, that's great, but let's add in variables relating to religion, and look, they matter too. And I've done work on United Nations voting, and there's standard stuff about the global South versus the West. I was like, okay, but also religious issues come up there as well. And so trying to address in that way and sort of taking the existing explanations and adding in the value of religion seems to matter. And that's something I've done in my work on religion and foreign policy, which we can talk about, is that uh, a metaphor someone is like throwing a brick through someone's window, right? Is they have to deal with it in some way. Like even if they reject it, even if they say you're wrong, at least making them recognize religion's a thing. And this does vary by the people you're talking to. So when I'm talking to my friends in the religion department, it's like obvious we all think religion matters. But then when we talk to people outside of it, they're just very skeptical, and a lot of that comes from the fact that they themselves, as you said, are not religious themselves. It's very secular as well. You know, I live in Vermont, which is probably the least religious state in the United States,
Interesting again. I didn't know that.
and it's interesting, right? So um, we've started adding religious holidays like Jewish and Muslim holidays to our calendar in recognition of religious diversity. But there's still a lot of things that come up, like things will be scheduled, like Friday evenings, which affects Jewish students, or a lot of things are scheduled Sunday mornings because most people don't go to church, and it is a struggle to figure out how do I, point out like maybe we should be a little more accommodating without seeming imperialistic, right? Especially as a Christian, you don't want to be imposing your views on secular or non-Christian people. And it's a balance that I've struggled with. And again, I think I'm at the point in my academic career where I'm going to try to do more public intellectual stuff, meaning I don't have to just publish academic articles that no one reads
Yeah.
anymore. And that's going to be some of what I'm trying to deal with, is how do we live together with different faiths, but also with secular people. Because when I was in DC working in religious freedom, the religious freedom community actually included space for agnostics and atheists and free thinkers. So like their freedom counts as well. The religious freedom community has gone off in a frustrating direction, which we can also talk about if you want. But when I was there at the time, it was very broad based to include that. So I think that was a good model.
Yeah, it's interesting, as you said, because there is it does depend on where you're at. I mean, here, Manchester, I could say it's quite secular. That's kind of the dominant. I think in university, that is also kind of the overarching thing. I mean, they do try to accommodate every now and then. They do like small gestures here and there, but I think even the thought of having these discussions, unless you're in that department, then it's not really. I think. Um, so probably just want to move in on one of the things that I wanted to touch on, and this one obviously as a Muslim it got my interest because you did you did a lot of work testing about whether an Islamic world exists in practice, and that's something I wanted to touch on first. So first of all, like I know you did kind of a network analysis, but so what did you find? What surprised you, and where does that assumption fail? Because I think that's kind of your stance.
Yeah, that's something I'm still working on and trying to get done. That was part of my sabbatical that I had 2 years ago now in University of Edinburgh. And sort of the starting point is I think about John Esposito, prominent scholar of Islam, wrote in one of his books that the underemphasis on Islam before 9/11 led to an overemphasis afterwards. So something like everyone's like, oh, when the AKP, the Justice Development Party in Turkey was elected because they're Islamic, is that tied to Al Qaeda? And assuming everything is connected that has to do anything with Islam. And as I mentioned, some of this takes on a problematic tone of overgeneralization, but also demonization. Like there's a problem with the Muslim world, which is difficult. But there's also more positive attempts to address it. So President Obama gave his speech to Cairo University that was like sort of an address to the Muslim world and resetting relations. But even that still seems a little tricky because you think about the Muslim world is Indonesia to Morocco. We also include Muslim minorities in Europe and the United States and India and elsewhere. Just that massive amount of diversity, it's hard to talk about like addressing one person, right? And so we've had the United States has had ambassadors to the Organization for Islamic Cooperation, which is great, but to think that means we're talking to the Muslim world is a little bit oversimplified. However, the problem is, I think that then a lot of people, especially in academia, went too far in the other direction. That you
Hmm.
had the Bernard Lewis's of the world maybe over exaggerating uniformity among Muslims, and then they sort of dismissed any role for Islam in a lot of politics. And that's sort of where I came in. Whereas I was reading, there's a lot of great, interesting, nuanced work about international relations among Muslim countries and societies. Right. So the OIC, Organization for Islamic Cooperation, is it's sometimes be a club for authoritarian leaders, but it's also a way for Muslim discourse to be mixed with the international arena. There's transnational relations among Muslims. There's a whole work of drawing on Islamic thought to rethink what international relations means. So there's something here that we can't just say Islam has no impact on international relations. Uh, and so I'm more of a quantitative person. So, okay, let's try to measure this quantitatively and using network analysis, which I thought was a good way to do it to get at the
Hmm.
sensitive nature of interactions. And so I said, this paper's still unpublished. I'm still working on it. But what I found was like, there is not a Muslim world. Spoiler alert, right? It's not like every
Hmm.
Muslim country interacts closely with each other and no one else.
Hmm.
But we break down to it, there are clusters of relations where Muslim states do seem to interact, and actually happens more among at the societal level. So you look
Yeah.
at transnational relations, a lot of Muslim societies are drawn together. It's not just because they're Muslim, right? It's often regional connections. It's often economic development, but there are some Islamic factors like how important Islam is in the state's functioning, like in laws, public opinion about how important Islam is in the country. And so I think there's something there in that we need to understand um, there's these separate spheres of international relations, some of which are influenced by religion, including Islam. And it's a starting point. I'm hoping we can look more into it. But there's a lot of interesting research going on right now, but a lot of it's very deep, very theoretical, very academic. So I'm hoping to push it a little bit. Um, and I've gotten interesting reactions to it, right? So some people who've read it, who work on Islam and international relations, like, oh, this is great. I don't understand what these numbers mean, but like the general findings fit with me. Uh, Others have actually said like this just feels too much like Orientalism. It feels too much like you're saying, Muslims are all the same, and I think that's an ethical concern that I have to take into account. So it's tricky, but to ignore the influence of Islam on international relations is to miss a big part of what's going on.
Hmm. Hmm. See, I think one of the things I find this is really interesting because it's very relevant. I mean, for me on mine, I only have lived experience, obviously, so I've not done the data crunching. But like, I remember me and my colleague the other day, she's Muslim as well, and we were kind of having this exact chat on the way back. Not this, I mean, not this one particularly, but what we were saying was like, it's funny how if somebody kind of doesn't know much about Islam, or the people we interact with, for example, in the UK and whatever, the common assumption is like a certain type of Islam, and that it's kind of primarily GCC countries because they're the ones who kind of study abroad and whatnot. And it's like all Muslims are like that, and we're like it's very completely different. If you talk to, for example, I'm Iraqi originally, an Iraqi Muslim or someone from Palestine, they would be quite different from someone from Saudi Arabia and whatnot. It's very, you know what I mean. They're not, but the way it gets is like they're all lumped into one kind of discourse. And then when you come in, they're like, "Oh, but you're different to them or from what you already know." And I'm like, "No, it's it's you only have one kind of cohort, and that doesn't represent the." I know I kind of babbled on, but that's kind of what I'm trying to say. It doesn't represent the whole of Islam. It's very different, even on the individual level. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and I think we definitely have to be sensitive to that. I mean, so I'm Episcopalian, so I'm part of the Anglican Communion, and even with that,
Mhm.
if I were when I visit English or Scottish churches, or if I were to go to African churches, it's so different. So to say like every Christian thinks the same would be a problem, and it's even more so with Islam. But then at the same time, we also have commonality. like a common frame of reference or common language we speak, so to,
Yeah.
not an actual language, right, but a reference to scripture and tradition. I think that's where some of the value comes in. But I do I comparing it to Christianity, I do recognize that the situation of Islam is different. And I was talking with a friend about I was writing something about the new Pope Leo, and how I think about him
Mhm.
as a Protestant. And we're talking about sort of the internal inside baseball self-critical discussions in Islam. And he was saying one of the issues that comes up with that is it's kind of like you're saying, you often feel the need to start with to explain so much to begin with, like what is
Mhm.
Islam? When we're talking about Sharia, what does that mean? That because so many non-Muslim audiences in the West just don't know it, that it's harder to get
Mhm.
to the next level. So I think that's a lot of like religious studies and Middle East studies are focused on that, like avoiding the overgeneralization and demonization. That's the big issue and the big priority for a lot of studies, which I think makes sense. Right?
Yeah, one of the things that I want to, I know the study is still not out there, but when people speak about unity among Muslims, and I don't want to get sidetracked, but like one of the rhetoric is always like, for people who don't know much, or people have certain worldviews, there's this kind of rhetoric as like, the Muslims are going to take over, the West, and they've got this kind of thing. And I always joke about it. I'm like, you give Muslim states way more credit than than they deserve. We are not like we can't organize anything amongst each other. You know what I mean? We can't get organized. Like we can't agree on a lot of things, and we can't organize anything. Like I don't know how they give us all this credit. Like we've got this one big scheme, and we're all plotting it together. So like when people speak among unity among Muslim states, like how does that square with the data that you have? Like like how does that kind of when they say there's this unity among Muslim majority states, how does that map onto what you're finding in the data?
Yeah, I just don't think there is. Like, so when I mentioned clustering of Muslim states, that means they interact with each other, not that they're marching in lockstep for whatever purpose people think
Mm,
is happening. Or if you look at the OIC and the debates that are happening there, it's like, resolutions come out of it. Things about religious defamation is something that, I've looked at. But we don't really know a lot of what goes on within it. But there is so much dissension, even just among the GCC countries, right? Saudi Arabia and UAE and everyone. Yeah, to say that
exactly.
there is unity in, I think there's like I said, a common maybe language or rhetoric, but it's not the same thing as unity of mission or purpose, and that gets dangerous, right? So every now and then in the states, these laws come up about worrying about Islamic law being implemented in Oklahoma or somewhere, and it's this fear that I think comes from a lack of understanding of how Muslim piety works. Like you should be allowed to express your religious beliefs no matter who you are in politics, but that's not the same thing as imposing on everyone. And I don't know. Well, I do know why it's such a fear because there's this Islamophobia among many people, but I wish it wasn't the case. So yeah, there's not a lot of evidence that Muslim states are working together to achieve something. And there's a great book. This is about Middle Eastern politics, not Muslim, but Dialogues in Arab Politics by Michael Barnett, where he studied debates in the Arab League um, between like the 50s and the 80s.
Mhm.
And what was interesting there is not that everyone agreed on everything, but that the debates were happening. And that's what was important, right? That there was this the common tropes of like we as an Arab people need to figure out, how best to represent ourselves, but they never really agreed on anything.
Yeah,
And we see that now with divisions among Middle Eastern states. Yeah.
that's very true. That's very interesting. So probably moving on to one other thing. I know you talk about religion being used as a tool of power. So you brought a bit about it, and you examine how states they use religious language or symbolism. So you've talked a bit about that. So like if you can just kind of elaborate on that, like when does that strategy work and when does it backfire? So I know you did a piece where you wrote about how states use religious language and symbolism to as a strategy. So like when do you see that working and when does it backfire?
Yeah, so that came from, there's been a lot of interesting work on that in American politics, where leaders will use religious cues or appeals to win over audiences. And it's not even making religious arguments. It's just acting like you're a good God-fearing Christian or whatever. Um, at the international level, there wasn't as much on it. There's ideas that states could use religious legitimacy to gain influence. There's ideas of religious soft power, so using religion to draw people to you. But it was hard to test, and this is something I was working on for a while, like from before tenure, so like several years ago up until now. And then it came out in my book, Religious Appeals and Power Politics, 2 years
Mhm.
ago. And basically, right, there's different views. There's that when states use religion as part of their foreign policy, it overcomes power politics, overcomes self-interest, and creates this better world. Well, there's a standard realist view that states might use religious or ideological arguments. That has no real effect on anything. All states care about is power, material
Mhm.
power. And it was sort of a mix, right? What I found was a mix in that it's not overcoming self-interest. It tends to be a tool for power, but it's having real effects on the world. And where it seems to have the best effect is when the state issuing the religious appeal. So telling people like, join our coalition to stand up for, you know, stand against extremism or to stand up for, or, good Muslims or something. Um, if the state issuing is a credible speaker on religious issues. And so one of the examples I gave was King Faisal in Turkey. Sorry, King
Mhm.
Faisal in Saudi Arabia.
Mhm.
Who was not everyone liked, but he was seen as like this guy's a pious person. He knows what he's talking about.
Yeah.
And then the material incentives, like if if there's some benefits to going along with it. And when those two are in place, we do see real effects. So like think of like Iran influencing Middle Eastern politics before some of the current conflicts. When they're both absent, then we don't see anything. But what we see most of the time is an in-between situation where maybe the speaker is very pious and credible, but there's material incentives to go against what they're saying or disincentives to
Mhm.
work with them. Or no one really buys the credibility of what the person's saying on religion, but they might go along because there's other benefits to it. And
Mhm.
so, I gave the example of Saudi Arabia, right? So Saudi Arabia tried to form this Islamic pact or Islamic alliance in the 1960s to counter Egypt and Nasser's pan-Arab influence. It didn't work, right? It didn't come together because Egypt was so powerful, but it really freaked everyone out. And so there's all this
Mhm.
evidence of, Nasser sending officials to the United States to get Saudi Arabia to stop this, or different, Syria or different communist groups issuing denunciations of this Islamic pact. So it really like upped the tension for a lot of people.
Mhm.
Another example is the United States with our global war on terror after
Yeah.
9/11. And so we did a lot of bad military and law enforcement actions like the invasion of Iraq or, renditions. But on top of that, there's this effort to appeal to Muslim societies and countries and try to build a coalition against extremism. And in this case, it was, there were incentives to go along with the United States in terms of avoiding US wrath and also getting benefits like trade. But, George W. Bush was always seen as the most credible speaker on Muslim affairs.
Mhm.
And so what happened here was we had some sort of alliances of convenience where states went along with us, but used it for their own purposes. So the
Mhm.
UAE says, "Oh yeah, we'll crack down on terrorism. Don't worry about it," and then sort of rounded up Islamic bloggers who were critical of the regime as part of that.
Mhm.
Or there was just general uncertainty. Like so the United States, a lot of foreign policy officials were like, "We don't know what these religious outreach programs are. We don't know what they're going to do," and so it's hard to tell if they're even effective. And so for the most part, what we're seeing is that in between area, that when you mix religion into foreign policy, it just makes things tense and worse. And I said this in the foreword to the book. This is actually not what I wanted to find. I was hoping to find that when you use religion in a crisis as a attempt to build a coalition, it works really well because it reassures people and brings them together. And that's not the case. And so this is a spoiler, but I have another article with some co-authors that is currently in revise and resubmit. So we're trying to get it published soon, where we tested this quantitatively with the Bush administration and the global war on terrorism. And we actually found that when Bush would make religious appeals, it would actually increase positive relations with a lot of Muslim societies. So they recognize, like, we're also concerned about extremism, and at least the United States is trying to help. But Muslim governments would not like it. They would react negatively because they're worried about him riling up their domestic publics or coming after them next. It's hard to say. So it is so there's something there in that there's a lot of interesting effects from mixing religion into power politics that cause this disruptive unsteadiness to international relations that I think we need to look further into. And so I haven't done enough yet to see if this is religion uniquely to religion, or if it's any sort of value or identity, like bringing any sort of belief system into power politics causes problems. I suspect there's something special about religion because it has such a deep hold on so many people. Conversely, if you don't care about religion, you're really suspicious of it. So it has much more of a polarizing impact than something like environmentalism or democracy or something.
Yeah, it's interesting because you dived into my next question. I was going to ask because I was aware you did a bit of work on Saudi Arabia and Egypt and post 9/11 America, and even a bit on modern Russia. So I was going to ask, like, I know this is a bit of it's tough to answer this because it's still kind of like what's the common thread among these cases, if that makes sense, if there is any.
Yeah, so I mean, the way I tried to think about it was, so right, Saudi Arabia, Russia, the United States, very different countries, different situations, different time periods. But we saw some of the similar dynamics, right, in that the states were using these religious appeals partly because they sincerely cared about them. Like George W. Bush is a person of faith, even if you disagree with his politics, but also for strategic reasons. Like they're not trying to convert people to the religion. They know this is a way to advance our interests and undermine our enemies. And so there is a realpolitik aspect to the use of religion in foreign policy. And then this, like I said, that common disruptive, unsteady effect. I was hoping actually again for a little more variation, like more cases of it actually working. And when I would interview people for the U.S. case, say, can you point to cases where you had like some kind of religious engagement program that really had dramatically positive effects? And like, not really. But one common element that came out of the U.S. case that I think I'm developing more in my current work is that what works best is not trying to change the world using religion, right? So Saudi Arabia could not reshape the Middle East in a year using appeals to Islam. Ironically, I mean, they kind of did that later, but that was partly from oil wealth. The United States could not overcome the deep suspicion, well-founded suspicion about what we're up to in the war on terrorism by giving nice speeches. And Russia, for all the problems it has caused with alliances and far-right politics, it hasn't really managed to create this durable pro-Russian coalition in Western Europe. They're still pretty suspicious, right? So it's not going to change the world. But what it is going to do is at the personal level, at the individual, the small local level, that's where it seems to matter. And so when I talk to people, I asked about successes. They would say, well, no grand successes, but there's a case of a couple young men in a mosque who were starting to watch ISIS videos, and their imam had developed good relations with the local FBI office, and they reached out and they like sat down and talked to them, and they explained what you want to do, and so they prevented them from going in a path that would have led to jail or worse, right? Or there's some initiative in Pakistan, working with local schools about, the textbooks and like how can we present a better view of Islam and, to be more pluralistic to students, and that sort of stuff seems to work. And on the one hand, you say maybe that's, excuse me, that's pessimistic, but I actually think that's a little optimistic. Is that we don't need to try to fix everything. We can try to save a couple people at a time through these religious outreach programs. And so that was one of the big takeaways of the book. We have to be a little more humble in what we're trying to
Mhm.
accomplish when we draw on religion and politics.
Once again, tying it into my lived experiences and the things I think about. So you talked about religion being, it can be used and it can have some effect um, in regions. I mean, I come from Iraq, probably fair to say one of the most countries that religion has a huge, unfortunately, negative effect. You know what I mean? Between Sunni, Shia, and all that kind of stuff, and it really got like, and even the non-Muslims and so on. So Iraq is like a melting pot. You know, we get very riled up to because of our religion, and sometimes it goes on a political level. So, like, what are the positives? Maybe that's what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, so there is this. There seems like a value in just avoiding talking about religion, and there's the sort of buttoned-up faith that people have of I have my faith, but it's a private thing. Why
Mm,
raise it with anyone else? Um, I think there's a value to that. Like I don't go around campus or my community telling people, hey, because I'm a Christian, I do this and this, because why would they care, right? It doesn't matter to them. Um, but then the flip side is that I think people who should feel comfortable expressing who they are, if there's so many parts of your identity that are important to you, religion shouldn't be the one that's hidden from view. And the trick is almost back to what we talked about at the beginning of sort of understanding how to live with people of different faiths or no faith. Like how do we accommodate that? And so like some of it's holidays for schools and being sensitive to that, or dietary restrictions. Always thinking about that as well. Um, so it's just being having the ability to talk, and we were having a Christmas party at my house, right? But people of different faiths and no faiths are coming, so we're not like enforcing. No one's praying or anything. It's a Christmas party because that's what we are. We celebrate Christmas, but no one else has to do that. Um, a conversation I had with a Muslim friend in DC. We went out and I ordered a beer and I'm like, oh shoot, is this okay? And he's like, I don't care. Like, are you gonna make me drink it? No, but then we had a conversation about like what is like when is it inappropriate? Like what would be seen as insensitive to you? And I think the building getting to the point where we can talk about these things is the best solution. And I prefer a few moments of tension around that to hiding who we are as people of faith or people of no faith, um, hiding who we are to avoid ever running into a difficult situation. But that also requires sensitivity and recognition of privilege. Like it's easy for me as a Christian in a even Vermont in a primarily Christian state to express my faith. Others might not be as comfortable, and I need to recognize like if a Jewish friend worries about wearing a kippah, you know maybe I can do something to help them or just be sensitive to what they choose not to do or whatever, right?
Yeah, I think I really like what you said is having a conversation around it, and even if there is a bit of tension, it resonates with me a lot because, for example, as you said, when I had to do the very long fast during Ramadan, I was terrified, to be honest, to tell my boss and whatever that it'd be nice if we don't have to start the meetings 9 a.m. in the morning because I want to kind of wake up a bit later on the day and so on. So for a big part, I avoided that. But then, once I did actually mention it, they were very accommodating, like, and as you said, like in the beginning, I thought there would be that tension, but they were like, okay, we'll work around that, and so on. So maybe there is something around having these conversations more frequently, rather than just saying, let's just ignore it doesn't exist and just kind of get on with that. So I think that's, sorry, I'm babbling here, but that's kind of a good approach. Um,
Yeah, and also I don't like the word ally because it's kind of a buzzword, but it also it fits in that people with power or privilege need to be willing to be allies. And I was thinking of one workplace we had an intern who was Muslim. He was praying in an empty office during the day, and someone walked by and made a disparaging comment. And when my boss heard about that, he like, he didn't like call out tell this everyone like be nicer to this person, but he basically was like, this is not okay. He pulled the person aside. He let all of us who were like middle management know, if you hear this, step in. And that kind of, when people are made to feel uncomfortable, those of us who have the I don't know, are in the position to help, need to do that. And I think that's something I try to be sensitive to. Like, yeah, okay, sometimes people make fun of Christianity to me, whatever. Like, that's not the same thing as what people of other faiths, especially religious minorities, go through. And I don't want to exaggerate my own situation.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think, do you think some of that has to do also with depending on the, I mean, I'll talk about my experience on the diversity of the workplace, because for us it's kind of a, we do have a kind of a blend. We've got people, from Jewish, Hinduism, and Muslims, Christians, atheists, and whatnot. So because there is a bit of that diversity, there is more of that kind of, I don't know. There's like a bit of a comfort among, like I'm at a point now in my work where I'm very comfortable, as you said, to pray, to do this and that, and it's the same thing, like when there's a Christmas dinner, we go along, we have a good time. But do you think part of that is because there is a bit of a, like let's say in a hypothetical example, they were all Christians, or they were all Muslims, or they were all like, there would be maybe, and there was that one oddball over there. Do you know what I mean? Like, does that change the dynamics, or I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, more diversity is better. Like growing up, we had one Jewish family in my town. Um, After being in Philly, we moved out to the country, and it was very Lutheran or Catholic, basically. Um, and so they would stick out, and even an attempt to be welcoming came off as a little bit condescending, because you're like, oh, tell us about yourself or whatever. Um, so diversity is always good if we can get there, but even without it, just finding ways to more constructively engage with everyone. Um, so my former boss from Pew, Brian Grimm, started a religious freedom and business foundation, and it basically is working with businesses to explain like supporting and recognizing religious expression and diversity is good for you, because then you have a better, your workforce is more committed and happier, and so I think that's been a great model there. It's just finding ways to more constructively engage and learn. Yeah.
Yeah, I really like that. So moving on a bit to a bit more of a serious topic or a serious tone, but I know you've done a bit of work around the consequences for people. You know what I mean? Of for example, religious power, where people they migrate or they leave, or some of them feel repressed. Now, yeah, one of the things that I wanted to touch on is how does that kind of shape people's experiences? Because from my, once again, not research based, this is just anecdotal evidence, is people who move abroad from a country that let's say there was religious oppression or whatever, the last thing they want to hear about is religion. Do you know what I mean? Like they grow up and like, we don't want anything to do with it. So how does it kind of shape either? Because I've always found it fascinating. There's the people who move, that migrate because of political circumstances. Some people actually want to cling on to their religious identity. Some people want nothing to do with that at all. So like, how does that kind of um, yeah, how does that shape up, or what's the consequences of religion for on people and their day-to-day lives?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, yeah, I've mostly focused on um, the bad stuff that happens, not what comes afterwards. But it does seem to be, when you look at the dynamics, it's often the first generation immigrants maybe are done with religion, if that's what they saw as causing problems back home, or really interested in assimilating and being part of the new country. And then the next generation often maybe feels a little rootless, like we miss what made us, what our culture or our homeland, and so there might be more piety there. And I think we've seen some of this in Europe with second or third generation Muslim immigrants being more pious than their parents or grandparents, and it fits a general pattern with I think even just like the boomers and then the millennials like me, where my parents just didn't want anything to do with the social structures of their parents. So my grandfathers were all Masons, Freemasons, and my
Hmm.
dad, stepdad, they had no interest in that. Whereas people my generation are like, we actually want to be part of something. And I say maybe it's um, a similar trend. And it can be a bad thing when the attempt to kind of recapture what you've lost takes on a sort of reactionary tone where you're creating this past that never existed,
Hmm.
and can lend more towards, extremism or exclusive versions of faith. But it can also be a good thing in that, if you're finding ways to reconcile uh, you know the modern social structures with your culture and your faith, which is very important to everyone. I can see something good coming out of that.
Hmm. Yeah, I think that's interesting what you said. It does kind of the appetite does kind of go up and down depending on the generation, and maybe as you said, for me personally, I've always wanted to reconcile that, and I've always found that something maybe because I didn't grow up with it, or so that longing for um, that longing for it. I don't know what the word I'm looking for.
Mhm.
But so you said you've mainly focused on the bad stuff, you know. So just kind of, yeah, I just wanted to elaborate on that. So in terms of consequences for people.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I my first job was in looking at terrorism and counterterrorism, so I focused on that, and then I moved beyond to like uh, the broader effects of counterterrorism policies on countries and religion. And even the last book, which is about religion and foreign policy, I was expecting a positive effect, and a positive in the sense that states could use it, not that it would be good for the world.
Hmm.
But as I mentioned back at the beginning, it's always been a weird tension for me that I'm a person of faith, and I know many people of faith, and it's a good thing. I like being a person of faith. So why do I think it's so bad when it's in the world, or in mixed up with politics? And part of it is that it gets mixed up with politics, and like the theme of my first wave of research, like my first couple years as an academic, was whenever religion and state become connected, there's a problem.
Hmm.
Um, and maybe that seems obvious, but there are people who think like this time it'll work. This time it'll be different. We can come up with like a good division of resources between Christians and Muslims, so everyone's happy. But uh, any sort of close ties between religion and state just seems to empower more extremist voices, marginalize certain groups. You decide who counts and who doesn't as a religious community. And it's just a problem. And this, again, some of this comes from my work at Pew, and with my former boss, Brian Grimm, where he had a great book called The Price of Freedom Denied, that found that when there's religion, religious freedom, as he said, was restricted, close ties between religion and state, that led to more pressure on the state by extremist groups to further restrict religious freedom, and just causes this bad cycle. Um, but again, so I wanted to think, but there has to be a positive way, and so I've started looking more into religion and peace. I taught a seminar on religion and peace building, um, and to be honest, a lot of the research on this is just not very good. It was examples of like, oh look, like here's religious groups trying to be peaceful. It's like, okay, fine, but I'm a social scientist. I need, are they actually having an impact on the world? It was like, oh, it sort of worked in Northern Ireland, but what about everywhere else? Um,
Hmm.
and so that was a little frustration. And so I found there's this great, relatively new sort of paradigm in peace studies called everyday peace by Roger McGinty of Durham in the UK, wrote a good book on it, where we need to stop looking for the next Good Friday agreement, or the next Oslo Accords or Oslo process. And instead, we want to see how people live out their lives day to day in a way that minimizes the horrors of conflict and prevents their village from breaking apart into a civil war that's happening elsewhere in the country. And so what I've been doing is I've been interviewing people involved in religious peace building efforts that one could say haven't worked out, but maybe are still ongoing. And so why do you persist? Why do you keep doing this? And find there's a lot of overlap. That the value of religious peace builders is that the credibility they bring to other people of faith, the deep connections they form with their communities, empowers the local everyday peace processes. So you're not going to see, I don't know, like we're not going to see perfect peace emerge in Nigeria, right? That comes up a lot with tensions between Muslim Christians.
Mhm.
But through these religious peace building efforts, we can find little bubbles of peace that emerge, and that's something, right?
Mhm.
And some of this maybe comes from my religious belief. I am a Christian. Like, I believe we live in a fallen world. We'll never fix everything, but we can do a lot to help people, and we have to do a lot to help people. That's part of our mission.
Yeah, I think I share the same kind of viewpoint as you. Yeah, like we're not going to
Mhm.
fix everything, but we have to kind of do our bit, if that makes sense. One of the reasons why I was interested in talking about is because as you said, like whenever there is kind of a major discourse or a major issue, there is always this kind of thing. It's like, see, this is kind of what religion does. It always pits people against each other. Probably have to use this one, and if you're not comfortable talking about it, it's fine. So you got the Israel-Palestine, for example,
Mhm.
situation. That's something that happened recently. And the first thing, if you see a lot of the rhetoric was like, see, this is what religion does, like this was how a lot of people framed it, like it's because two people, which it's not because of that, but like because of the religious beliefs and whatnot, they're doing this again. So you know what I mean? That's always kind of like the framing is like, um, yeah, it does little good here and there, but the net outcome is usually negative on the whole. So I'm not sure if I'm asking a question here, but like that, where I'm getting
Yeah,
going is like, what's kind of your take on that? Because it's something I grapple with as well.
yeah. I mean, it's hard. So, like, in terms of conflict, right? So, the Israel Palestine, it's not because of religion, right?
Yeah.
Religion gets wrapped up in it. That makes it harder to reconcile. But to have this fatalistic idea, like, oh, they've always been fighting, they'll always fight. That's not true, and not helpful. Um, and some of it gets to like what we think of with religion. And so Joseph Campbell, the like mythic scholar, whatever he wrote on, told some story in one of his books that like when they had Roman Catholic priests and clergy from other faiths get together, they had a hard time connecting because it was the scripture and the theology and the organizational differences. But when they had the monks, like the more spiritual people in different faiths meeting, they all like got along with each other. And then some of that, if we can get away from some of the division of responsibility and who controls what, versus just connecting as people of faith, that can matter. And there's this story of I'm blanking who it was, but it was an evangelical minister who does a lot of interfaith work in the United States with Muslims, and he said like we'll often get together and we'll joke like, okay, fine, we each think the other person's going to hell. We'll set that aside and worry about that later, and let's just like live with each other. And that's I don't know. I don't know if that's a good attitude or not, but like it is like there are certain differences we're not going to reconcile, but as people of faith, we're called to find what we can reconcile and just love each other. I mean, that's the basis of every faith. If I can make a generalization like that.
Yeah, that's kind of the thing I wanted to move on is vision for the future, right? Because we pointed out some of the things. So from your work, where do you find reasons for optimism? You know what I mean? Like, okay, you said there's a bit of the interfaith dialogue, sharing a bit of jokes here and there, but like, yeah, where do you find room for optimism? If so far, based on what you told me, I'm not quoting you here. The majority of it is kind of um, is bad, for lack of a better word. But
Yeah, I mean, I think the optimism is the fact that so many people are still trying. I
mm,
don't know if that's a low bar or not, but when I've talked to people involved in religious peace building, they're not naive. They're not like, yeah, we're going to solve everything. It'll be done by next year, what have you. They know it might not work out. They know they've run into lots of problems, but they still feel compelled to keep working at it, right? And they can point to specific examples that give them the faith and the hope to keep trying. So that's something. And as long as we have like just a couple people working at it, I think that's encouraging. The problem, though, is that's not how most um, kind of governments and funding agencies and scholars think. Like they think, and that's how I used to think. Like, yeah, okay, fine. I have friends who work on religious engagement. What are they accomplishing? And so we need to find a way to explain to these groups that your standard metrics for success of like a peace agreement or you know new farms established or whatever they would say is like economic development. That's not right. Instead, we need to find a way to measure these local everyday peace indicators. So that's actually one of the things that the Everyday Peace Project, they have like a website and they're like collecting indicators for what it looks like to have everyday peace. And so I'm very excited as that project continues to see. I think that's a good way to revamp that and show like this is how religion can help at this local level.
Yeah, and just out of curiosity, for being a researcher, so like how, like what kind of indicators are they going for? You know what I mean? Like how can you measure that? This is a pure research question. I know, sorry, like the academic side of me, but yeah, like
Yeah. So I'm not part. I've talked with the people involved, but I'm not really part of the project.
mhm,
Um, but it looks like they're still collecting and they're going to release data sets. But it seems like they actually have almost like questionnaires they send out to people who are doing this on the ground. And so, like for you, what does peace look like? What do you do that seems to lead to peace? Those kind of indicators.
mhm,
Um, I but I organized a workshop in Newcastle, UK, in October with Jason Klochek, who's a great scholar at the University of Nottingham, to talk about religious and peace building. And one of the takeaways was that, yeah, we don't really know what the indicators are yet. It's like we know there's something there. You know, I can talk and I have my qualitative interviews, but we do need hard indicators if we're going to really
okay,
make the case to governments and funders. And I don't think we're not there yet,
uh-huh. Yeah.
but I'm hoping we get there.
All right, yeah, and one thing I wanted to this is just out of pure interest because as I said, like my best friend and I call him my brother, like we have a lot of conversations. I mean, as I said, he's Christian, I'm Muslim. One of the things that we kind of dabble with or we talk about a lot is focusing on I mean, obviously from a theological standpoint there are differences and whatnot, but on the commonalities. I don't mean commonalities from a theology standpoint. I mean commonalities in terms of being a person of good character. Does that make sense? I think one of the things that faith all share in common is like there's this you have to kind of be the best person you can be, or you know what I mean? Like trying to have this a certain moral vision or like a standard that you need to live up to, and we feel some of that is kind of dying out in the modern day, for lack of a better word. And I always feel like we have our most amazing conversations when we really focus on that part of Christianity or Islam, is like what are the parts that really try to for you as a Muslim, as a Christian in your faith, that tell you to hold that high standard. So I've always found it. Um, I don't know if I'm babbling here, but focusing on the moral code or sometimes the aesthetics as well. Like he would talk to me and tell me some of all the aesthetics around Christianity, and I've always found it quite interesting. Because Christian and Islam are quite different in their philosophical and the way they. But I've always found that part interesting. Do you know what I mean? So it's more than just holding hands and saying kumbaya, we love each other, but kind of seeing the underlying things, because I think religions do have a common thread, regardless of theology and whatnot, whether it's aesthetics, whether it's that moral ground and that kind of, that purpose, which a lot of it, there's like a meaning crisis now going on. So I think that's one of the things it holds on really well. I'm not sure if I'm asking a question, I'm just babbling, but like, yeah, I just wanted your thoughts on that before. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean that's a great way to put it. It's so I use the word essentialist in a negative sense, right? Because it's used to like overgeneralize. But you think of like distilling religions down to their essences, and so much it is about, right, as you said, being a good person and caring for other people. And we have different ways that we act on that and different rules for how we do that. But that's ultimately what the goal is. Um, so the former presiding bishop of the Episcopal Church in the U.S., Michael Curry, said, "If it's not love, it's not God." I think that holds up for I mean every faith. I haven't studied every faith, but I can't picture a faith that's not the case, right? And so that's, on the one hand, being a good pious person is hard. On the other hand, it's not. In that if you're acting in a way that's not loving or compassionate or caring, then you're probably not doing something right. And I think that's a good way to think about it. I do struggle what that means for people who are not religious. I've never I've had conversations with like my dad and I have talked about this for some reason recently, and uh, I don't know that I see that you have to be religious to be a good person. Like I can see a good code of ethics coming from secular belief systems. Um, so this is maybe a different way to get at virtue that I think is valuable. But yeah,
Yeah, I agree with you on that one. I think, yeah, you don't have to, a lot of people make the argument, and it is valid, it's not like you have to be a religious to be a good person. You can logically, come up to these conclusions, be a good person, whatnot. But for me, I think it's that greater sense of purpose, you know what I mean? And doing something for the greater good, if that makes sense. I think religion kind of gives you that, like where there's something more than just me, there's something bigger than me. But anyway, that's my take. It's kind of how I see it. Um,
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I think Benedict Anderson wrote a great book, Imagining Communities, on nationalism, and like the nation is it's like a people with sovereign control of a territory, whereas religion, he talked about having sort of universal scope and universal legitimacy, and that's one benefit of religion is that it pushes you outside of your narrow zone. Like I'm not just a Vermonter. Well, I'm not a Vermonter. I wasn't born here, but I'm not a resident of Vermont. I'm not just an American, right? I'm a Christian, but I'm also not just a Christian. I'm a person of faith. I'm a human, and I think yeah, you're right. That is one benefit of religion.
all right. So just moving on for concrete takeaways now before we wrap this up. So as I said, this is LA audience, so we're not dealing with academics here. I mean, there might be some academics, but what's one idea that you'd want, just a layperson, not somebody, to walk away with about religion and international politics, or one of them?
Yeah, one idea. I mean, I think if I could try to distill what I've been doing for the past whatever 10, 15 years, it's that when religion is used in service of politics or the state, it's bad. Things go bad, right?
Mhm.
But when religion is used to challenge the state and challenge everyday politics, that's when we get good things happening. So you have to find a balance. Like, how do you be engaged as a person of faith without falling prey to letting political concerns drive your faith? And that's the important part.
Yeah, I think that's well said. I know it's never easy to kind of boil down 10, 15 years of work into two sentences, but I think that kind of captures it. And another question would be, what widespread assumptions about the Muslim world would you hope listeners to rethink?
Yeah, I mean, so I think I would hope that many people have moved on from like the assumption that like Al Qaeda and Bin Laden speak for Muslims, but I know some haven't, and so I hope they would change that. There's also this problematic argument I've seen this in the states that Islam doesn't really count as a religion because it's political, and I don't know what that means. I mean, it means in practice they want to take away religious freedom, but every religion has something to say about politics, and so I think that's a problem. But also about the Islamic world, that, like we said in the beginning, there's incredible diversity. So yes, even though Islam matters to many people, it matters in different ways, and you don't want to just assume and generalize.
Yeah. Right then. So that sums up the podcast. I don't want to hold you any longer. I know you're a busy guy. But for those listening, I mean, where can they find a bit about you if they want to read about your work or your next projects? Where do we signpost them to?
Yeah, so my website, my at the University of Vermont, I think is active. An update, I should make sure. Um, Cornell University Press is the publisher of my latest book, so you can find it through them. I'm also editor and frequent contributor at the Duck of Minerva, which is like an international relations blog where we write about academic topics, but for like a public audience. So there's lots of interesting stuff going on there.
Interesting. All right. Thank you once again.
Great, thanks a lot.